Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Colleen Parsons. I teach in the English department here in Georgetown, and I'm a member of the leadership team of Global Irish Studies at Georgetown on campus, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about in a minute before we kick off tonight's keynote speech by Senator Mitchell. But first, Irene Gilson is here in the front, and Gerard Mannion, who you have all heard from probably, and I are so grateful to all of our speakers today, all of our panelists, and all of you, all our guests in the audience, who've helped to make this occasion truly significant and truly meaningful. We're grateful for illuminating conversations, and we're grateful for ideas that have provided much food for thought for us for the next few months. We're especially grateful to our hosts, the ever-generous Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, whose staff, thank you very much, have looked after us so well over the course of today. And we're grateful to the Office of the President of Georgetown University, President DeGioia, for their support as well. And also thankful to the Northern Ireland Bureau, Norman Houston, thank you very much, and the Irish Embassy, Michael, and obviously the Ambassador, who is sorry he can't be here. Thank you for your support. But personally, I want to say one very important word of thanks from Irene and from me to Gerard Mannion, who put together the entire program for today. It has been stimulating and fascinating so far, and I'm looking forward to more. So will you join me in thanking Gerard? But I want to thank you all for something else that you may not have known that you were part of. I want to thank you for making today such a great investment in the future of global Irish studies at Georgetown University. Today's event is a golden opportunity for us, for Irene, for Gerard, for all of the faculty and students who are interested in Irish studies at Georgetown University, to reach out to potential long-term partners and supporters for global Irish studies at Georgetown, and to promote our development goals to a wider audience. In particular, to begin our appeal for seed funding for the plans for global Irish studies, especially through reaching out to our alumni and our friends in the Irish and Irish American community across DC. We've organized, the Global Irish Studies Initiative has organized a number of very successful events on campus to date, including hosting the 2016 Mid-Atlantic meeting of the American Conference for Irish Studies, which brought over 100 experts in Irish studies to campus, and also holding a series of events commemorating the centenary of the 1916 Easter Rising, which saw over 800 people come to campus to listen to and participate in events about Irish studies. Leading Irish and Irish American poets and novelists have appeared on campus at our Irish Studies events, as well as key politicians and diplomats. With these events and more, Georgetown Global Irish Studies has already attracted wide interest and excitement across the campus and in the DC, Maryland, Virginia region. And it continues to develop partnerships with a range of organizations and governmental representatives. We're now at a stage where we want to shape a development plan to place global Irish studies at Georgetown on a long-term trajectory in terms of infrastructure, facilitation, and organization to make possible a range of teaching, research, and cultural initiatives and transformative programming and events. We have three core prongs to global Irish studies: engaging the community, inspiring students, and enabling research. And all of these will be informed by our commitment to seeing Ireland in global and comparative perspective at all times. It'll also be guided by Georgetown University's long-standing and wider commitment to racial equality and social justice, particularly given the Republic of Ireland's status as the country in Europe with the highest percentage of residents born outside of its borders. We have big dreams and aspirations for global Irish studies at Georgetown. We aim to make Georgetown a global leader in the field of Irish studies within 5 years. It's ambitious, but we know we can do it, and we can do it with your help. The secret to our success will be people like you. Today, you're enjoying a taste of what we can achieve with sufficient support. Imagine the limitless possibilities that can grow in Irish studies once this initiative has proper funding and an administrative structure to make events such as this conference and even bigger programs happen here at Georgetown and DC on a regular basis. The very least we ask of you today is to help us spread the word. the Georgetown University Initiative in Global Irish Studies is open for business and up and running. If you have ideas about programs and projects you'd like to see developed, let us know. If your institution, business, or organization can partner and collaborate with us, tell us loudly. If you can help establish connections with philanthropic individuals and organizations who can help us establish Irish studies and make it a reality, all the sooner, please don't hesitate to come and talk to us. Finally, if you are one of those individuals who can become a benefactor and a patron of Georgetown University's Global Irish Studies, then allow us to invite you to campus so that we can tell you more about our plans. You'll see more about Global Irish Studies and ways to connect with us in the leaflet that you have probably seen at your seat, and if not, you can get it at the door on the way out. Georgetown University, as you all know because you're here, is one of the top-ranked research universities in the United States. And given its location in Washington, D.C., and its long-standing commitment to teaching and research in global studies, it's a perfect home for this new initiative. We warmly invite all of you, from those of you involved in the business and corporate world to those who work in government, NGO, and cultural sectors, to partner with us, to partner with Georgetown University Global Irish Studies to help ensure that this fledgling initiative grows into the interdisciplinary world leader that we aspire for it to become. We know that with your help, we can reach our goals and our aims. So feel free to talk to Irene, to Gerard, to me, to reach out to us by email, on Facebook, on Twitter, or any other way, in person or not in person, that you can contact us. It remains for me this evening to introduce a very great friend of Ireland and a very great friend of Irish Studies at Georgetown University, and it is my great pleasure to introduce him. For close to 4 decades, Dr. John J. DeGioia has helped to define and strengthen Georgetown University as a premier institution for research and education. A Georgetown alum, Dr. DeGioia served as a senior administrator and as a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy before becoming Georgetown's 48th and longest-serving president in 2001. As a president, Dr. DeGioia is dedicated to deepening Georgetown's tradition of academic excellence, its commitment to its Catholic and Jesuit identity, its engagement with the Washington, D.C. community, and its global mission. It is my great pleasure to invite Dr. DeGioia to the stage.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Colin. And it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to be with all of you here this afternoon as we welcome the Honorable George Mitchell back to Georgetown on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And Senator Mitchell, it is always an honor to have you back here with us, and I look forward to introducing you in just a few moments. I'd like first to offer my appreciation to all who have shared their perspective throughout the day today, especially former Congressman Bruce Morrison and his biographer, Penn Rhodeen, Norman Houston, the director of the Northern Ireland Bureau, Michael Lonergan, the Deputy Ambassador of Ireland to the United States, Michael Tatum, the Deputy Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the United States, Robert Fauché, the Director of the State Department's Western Europe Office. We also want to thank the Embassy of Ireland to the United States and the Northern Ireland Bureau for your support in organizing today's events. And I, too, want to express my appreciation to Professor Gerard Mannion, Dr. Irene Gilson, and to Colin Parsons for your efforts to advance Georgetown as a leader in the field of Irish studies. And Professor Mannion, thank you for leading our question and answer session a little bit later this evening. So just last week, a special conference was held in Ireland at Queen's University in Belfast in remembrance of the historic agreement that we have been reflecting on today. As part of this event, Senator Mitchell moderated a panel discussion with former President Bill Clinton, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and former Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern. During his reflections, President Clinton summarized the impact of this agreement, and he said, quote, "By creating a space for the identity and the interests and the values of all the people involved, in a framework which protected democracy and let future demographic, economic, and political changes take Northern Ireland wherever it would go. The Good Friday Agreement was a work of surpassing genius, close quote. Well, this work of surpassing genius, which ended decades of conflict in Northern Ireland, could not have been accomplished without the distinguished leadership of the Honorable George Mitchell, the chair of the 1998 peace talks, which led to the Good Friday Agreement, a dedicated public servant who has modeled a commitment to cooperation and collaboration in pursuit of peace throughout his entire career. A graduate of Bowdoin College in 1954, Senator Mitchell went on to serve as an officer in the U.S. Army Counterintelligence Corps in Berlin from 1954 to 1956. Then after graduating from our law center in 1961, he spent nearly 20 years as an attorney and later as a U.S. district judge in his home state of Maine before he was appointed to the United States Senate in 1980. Elected to a full term in 1982, he then served for 15 years, assuming key leadership roles on the Finance, Veterans Affairs, Environment, and Public Works committees, and helped to pass many landmark bills, including the reauthorization of the Clean Air Act, the first national oil spill prevention and cleanup law, and a low-income housing tax credit program. He was instrumental in the passage of the Americans with Disability Act, and he helped to support higher education that expanded opportunities for millions of Americans. When he left the Senate in 1995, he took on the position of Special Advisor on Ireland to President Clinton, and in 1998, he brokered the historic deal we remember today, the Good Friday Agreement. Senator Mitchell's extraordinary efforts, whether leading a fact-finding commission to ease tensions between Israel and Palestine, directing an investigation into the use of performance-enhancing drugs by Major League Baseball players, or serving as the U.S. Special Envoy for Middle East peace from 2009 to 2011, all reflect his exceptional commitment to public service and his willingness to grapple with many of the most difficult diplomatic challenges of our time. In his own words, quote, "Nothing matches serving a cause larger than one's self-interest," close quote. This understanding of the importance of service has been an animating force, one that has inspired him to support the cause of peace in our world. For his many contributions, he's been awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor given by the United States government, the Philadelphia Liberty Medal, the Truman Institute Peace Prize, the UNESCO Peace Prize, and just last week, along with President Clinton, the Freedom of the City Belfast Award. Nearly 20 years ago, we got ahead of all those folks, and we honored him with a Georgetown University honorary degree. And then last year, during our John Carroll Awards weekend in Austin, Texas, our Alumni Association gave him one of their highest honors, the Timothy S. Healy Award. Senator Mitchell is a transformative leader, an exemplary public servant, and it's truly an honor to have him back here on our hilltop today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Senator George Mitchell.
Thank you. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your warm reception. My thanks to President Gioia for that really wonderful introduction, to Professor Mannion, Dr. Gilson, all of you previous panelists, many of whom are here in the front row. And ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to participate in this event. However, I have to say that this is at least the 20th speech I've given on the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement. And so I've heard myself say it so often that for me today, and increasingly as I speak. The highlight of the day is the introduction. And I want to thank President DeGioia. Next time I go to Northern Ireland, I'm going to take him with me to have him introduce me. That was really nice. I don't know most of you, so it's always nice to have pleasant things said about you in front of a group of strangers. There is a risk, however, that if you hear it often enough, you may begin to believe it. So I always like to begin with a story about introductions and an occasion on which I was brought back down to earth. After I completed my service in Northern Ireland, I chaired 3 separate sets of discussions over a span of 5 years. I returned to my home in Maine, and I wrote a book about the experience. When it was published, I went on a book promotion tour around the country. In the process, I received many invitations, and I learned the interesting fact that in the United States, there are more Irish American organizations than there are Irish Americans. And every one of them invited me to go and speak to them. I couldn't go to them all, but I did go to many. And as I traveled the country speaking to these Irish American groups, they developed among them an informal competition as to who could give the longest, most fantastic, sometimes quite ridiculous introductions of me. In Chicago, a guy got up and he read off for 30 minutes everything I had done in my life. It was especially interesting to me because a good bit of it I had not been aware of until he read it out. So the proper reaction, of course, would have been for me to show some humility, to ask them to please keep it short. But I had an improper reaction. I loved it. I encouraged them. I scolded them when they left something out. And so by the time I got to the last stop on this book tour, I was overly impressed with myself. It was in Stamford, Connecticut. And when I entered the building, a very large crowd, the first person I encountered was an elderly woman who rushed up to me, nervous and very excited, shook my hand vigorously, and then spoke rapidly for several minutes, praising me, saying what a great man I am, all the wonderful things I've done around the world. Then she said, I don't live anywhere near here. I drove across the entire state of Connecticut 3 hours just to shake your hand and to ask you, please, will you autograph my poster? She handed me a poster with a photograph and a pen. I said, well, of course I will. I said, but before I do, I think there's something I should tell you. She said, what is it? I said, I'm not Henry Kissinger. It was a poster of Kissinger. She said, you're not? Well, who are you anyway? And when I told her, she said, well, that's just terrible. She said, I drove 3 hours to meet a great man like Kissinger, and all I've got is a nobody like you. I said, I'm sorry you feel so bad. I wish there's something I could do to make you feel better. And she thought for a moment. She said, well, there is. When I asked what it was, she leaned forward. I leaned forward. We were sort of in a conspiratorial crouch. And she said in a low voice, nobody will ever know the difference. She said, would you mind signing Henry Kissinger's name to my poster? So I did. And it's hanging today in her living room wall in Connecticut, a daily reminder to me to enjoy very much these kind words by especially distinguished people like President DeGioia, but don't take him too seriously. But I will be serious about the subject we're discussing because it is an important part of my life. It was just 20 years ago that the governments of the United Kingdom and Ireland and 8 Northern Ireland political parties declared their support for the agreement that we celebrate this evening. In the current difficult political climate in Northern Ireland, I think it's important for all of us to recall and to heed the powerful and moving words by which the governments and the parties pledged their support for peace. And I'd like to read just a couple of paragraphs of the introduction to the Good Friday Agreement. The tragedies of the past have left a deep and profoundly regrettable legacy of suffering. We must never forget those who have died or been injured and their families, but we can best honor them through a fresh start in which we firmly dedicate ourselves to the achievement of reconciliation, tolerance, and mutual trust, and to the protection and vindication of the human rights of all. We are committed to partnership, equality, and mutual respect as the basis of relationships within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between these islands. We affirm our total and absolute commitment to exclusively democratic and peaceful means of resolving differences on political issues, and our opposition to any use or threat of force by others for any political purpose, whether in regard to this agreement or otherwise. Strong words, deeply moving words. When I announced the agreement, I described it as an historic achievement, which it was. But I also said on that day that by itself the agreement did not guarantee peace or political stability or reconciliation. It made them possible. But achieving and sustaining those lofty goals would require of future leaders the vision and courage that the leaders of Northern Ireland in 1998 demonstrated. And I hope that the current leaders of Northern Ireland, of Ireland, of the United Kingdom, and of the European Union, as they today reflect on their responsibilities, will look back 20 years to what their predecessors did. Much has been said and written about the long and difficult road that led to the agreement. Many have deservedly received credit for their roles. Among public officials, UK Prime Minister Tony Blair and his predecessor, John Major. Irish Prime Minister Bertie Ahern and his predecessors, Albert Reynolds and John Bruton. They and their governments laid the foundation for the negotiations, and then they brought those negotiations to a successful conclusion. Both were ably assisted by a dedicated corps of public officials on both sides who were magnificent in their patience, skill, and determination. President Bill Clinton was the first American president to make peace in Northern Ireland a central objective of his administration. He and Mrs. Clinton were deeply concerned about the adverse effects of continued conflict. They became involved in and concerned about the lives of all of the people of Ireland. But the real heroes of the agreement were the people of Northern Ireland and their political leaders. The people supported the effort to achieve the agreement, and afterward they voted overwhelmingly to ratify it. The political leaders, in dangerous and difficult circumstances, after lifetimes devoted to conflict, summoned extraordinary courage and vision, and they reached agreement at great risk to themselves, to their families, to their political careers. Today, all across the Western world, it's fashionable to demean, to insult, to ridicule political leaders. Certainly, much of it is deserved. But we don't pay enough attention or tribute to those political leaders who do dare greatly and succeed. In Northern Ireland, these were ordinary men and women. But after 700 days of failure, they joined in one day of success, and they changed the course of history. I return to Northern Ireland often because I love the place and the people. They're energetic and productive, a pleasure to be with. Now, it's true that they're argumentative and can be quick to take offense. As the late David Irvine, a great man and a good friend, said to me loudly on the very first day of the negotiations, "Senator, if you are to be of any use to us, there's one thing you must first understand." When I asked what it was, he replied, "We in Northern Ireland would drive 100 miles out of our way to receive an insult." He was right, but nobody's perfect. The current problems in Northern Ireland are difficult, serious, and must be resolved. But at the same time, we should not hold Northern Ireland to a higher standard than we apply to others or to ourselves. Every society, including the United States and the United Kingdom and Ireland, has social and political problems. When I got off the plane in Dublin about 10 days ago, I began several days of television interviews. And over again, I was asked, "Isn't it terrible what's happening in Northern Ireland? All this political dysfunction." I said, "Well, I just got off the plane from the United States." And I don't feel I or any other American is in a position to preach to someone else about political dysfunction. And on one of the interviews, there was a guy waiting for the next interview from the UK government. I said, "This guy just come from London." I said, "They got problems of their own too." So we have to be careful about not holding Northern Ireland to some artificial standard because they've had such an extraordinarily difficult past. I believe that what we Americans must do is to reaffirm to the people and the leaders of Northern Ireland our dedication to the principle that political difference should be resolved through democratic and peaceful means, not through the use or threat of violence. Our strong and unwavering encouragement and support, our trade and tourism. I'm asked over and over again by Americans, "What can I do?" And my answer is every single American can be a peacemaker in Northern Ireland through trade, through tourism, through attention, through support. All of it to make clear through tangible ways our concern and devotion to the cause of peace and prosperity in Northern Ireland. The UK government and the European Union have publicly committed themselves in December to a Brexit outcome that does not reestablish a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. We welcome and accept their commitment. We support it, and we insist that they now do what they said they're going to do. And the governments of both the United States and the United Kingdom must avoid any political or economic decisions that cost jobs and create hardship in Northern Ireland. My years in Northern Ireland changed my life, and so I want to close before the question and answer period with some personal comments. My father's parents were born in Ireland. They became part of the Great Migration as millions crossed the Atlantic Ocean in search of freedom and opportunity in the New World. Many succeeded. Many did not. My father never knew his parents. His mother died early. His father could not care for the children, so my father was raised in an orphanage. After several years, he was adopted by an elderly, childless couple who were not Irish and who lived in a small town in Maine. My father had little schooling. He left school at the age of 10 to begin a long life of hard work as a laborer, and he ended up as a janitor at a local school. My mother was an immigrant from Lebanon. She could not read or write, and she spent 50 years working the night shift in a textile mill. My parents were very poor, and they died penniless. But in their minds, they were successful because, thanks to the openness of American society, their children had the good luck to get an education and to lead lives that would be completely beyond the imagination of my parents. My father had no sense of his heritage. I'd never heard him say the word Ireland. So when President Clinton asked me to go to Northern Ireland, I too lacked any sense of Irish heritage. But in the years since, I've come to know and to love the people of Ireland, North and South. I've been blessed to make so many friends, to be so warmly received all across that beautiful island. I like to think that my father is up above looking down, pleased that his son has had the chance to understand his heritage as he never could. This is a digression, but I want to say it because it's what's in my heart. I don't know most of you, but I'm certain that many of you have lived similar stories. I do know President DeGioia, and I'm pretty confident that there were no DeGioias on the Mayflower. All of us stand on the shoulders of our parents and grandparents, many of whom endured hostility, scorn, and demonization. I graduated from high school when I was 16. I had never been away from home. And on the day that I left to go to college, my father sat me down at the kitchen table. He was in his work clothes, just leaving for work. My mother had just come home from her night in a textile mill. She was covered with lint. And my father, who was a quiet man who rarely spoke, said to me, "You're a smart kid. You're going to do well. But wherever you go, whatever you do, look at your mother, look at me. Don't you ever forget where you came from." I never have. And I hope all of you, and I hope all Americans who shared that experience never forget where they came from either. Many have thanked me for my work in Northern Ireland. My response is that it is I who should be grateful, and I am, because my experience there filled a void within myself that I didn't even know existed. I am an American, very proud of it, and always will be. But a large part of my heart and of my emotions will forever be with the people of Northern Ireland. May God bless them with peace, with prosperity, and with reconciliation. Thank you all very much for having me here.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Mitchell, for that inspiring talk and very moving talk. And once again, let me echo a warm welcome back to your alma mater, Georgetown. We're so thrilled to have you here. A multi-pronged question to begin with. Why do you think President Clinton chose you to be the special envoy to Ireland? Why did you decide to accept? And did you know much of the history of the conflict before you went there?
He told me why he chose me. He said to me, "I'm really serious. I want to do something to help in Northern Ireland. You, speaking to me, he said, you are the outgoing majority leader of the United States Senate. And if you go as my representative, it'll be an indication of how serious I am. And I accepted because while I retired from the Senate, I didn't want to retire from public life. I've been asked often why I left the Senate. Well, my predecessor, Senator Muskie, a truly great man, said to me when he left to become Secretary of State, he said, better to go when they're begging you to stay than wait until they demand you leave. And so while I had no opposition, I thought it would be a good time to leave, but I still like public service, I still do. And so to me, it was an opportunity to make a transition to private life, but also to remain active in public affairs. And what was the third part? That was a long question.
Did you know much of the history of the conflict before you went to Ireland?
I did not.
Right.
I did not. No, I had only been, I'd never been in Northern Ireland. I'd been in Ireland only once for one day. While I was Senate Majority Leader, I made several trips to the Balkans in connection with the various conflicts that arose with the disintegration of Yugoslavia. And on one flight back, we stopped at Shannon for refueling, and I decided to spend a day just seeing Ireland. So I literally spent one day, I drove the Ring of Kerry.
Okay.
Yeah, which was a great experience because the town I grew up in Maine is Waterville, Maine. So I had this rented car, and I was there for one day, and I drove around, and I saw this sign, entering Waterville. I thought, God, this is a dream. I didn't even know it was there. This is a dream come true. So it was very nice, but I did not have a great deal of knowledge. I became acquainted with it a little bit in a year or so earlier when Ted Kennedy, Chris Dodd, and Pat Moynihan asked to see me. I was the Senate Majority Leader, and they came into my office, and they asked me to sign a letter to President Clinton, encourage him to give a visa to Jerry Adams. And so I got a little bit into it then. I did sign the letter, and Teddy and Chris and Pat, who are all dear friends, talked to me from time to time about it, as did others. There were quite a few people in the House who were also active at the time. And so I got a little bit of knowledge about it, but really it was not anything I had much information about. In the course of my first year and a half there, before the talks began, I read probably about 3 dozen books on the history, every aspect of it, North, South, Ireland, the UK, and so forth. So I felt by the time I got there, I got a little better informed, and it's a wonderful place.
So once you'd appraised yourself of the history and the realpolitik of recent times, and you began the job in earnest, were you convinced that peace was possible from the moment you began the job in earnest?
No, I was not convinced of that. In fact, I knew it would be very difficult. I'd been there. It doesn't take very long when you get there, back in those days, to figure out that there are real problems there. Ceasefires had been declared by the IRA in the summer of 1994 and by the Loyalist paramilitaries in October of that year. I arrived the following January, and it was anything but peaceful. It was very difficult. I kept asking myself, what must it have been like before the ceasefires, because there were, as you know, regular and repeated violations of the ceasefire. In fact, a year and a half later, when the talks began, I just got married when I left the Senate, and my wife and I planned to spend that first summer, when the talks began in June of 1996, in Belfast. But not too much longer after that, there was an outbreak of considerable violence, rioting, and the security services came to me and said, your wife can't stay. Just too difficult, and we can protect you, they said to me, because the talks were held in a gated compound that was heavily protected. But she was in a hotel, and so she left and went to London, and I commuted back and forth to London that first summer. So it's a pretty good indication of what it was like.
So once you had began the job, how did you set about trying to win the trust of the different parties and communities in Northern Ireland?
Well, my entry was very controversial. When the talk started, it was on June 10th, I remember it like it was yesterday, Prime Minister Bruton and Prime Minister Major came, and they gave very nice opening talks, and then they left. And I thought, I'm going to go in and assume the chair. Now, there were 10 political parties, 2 governments, and the chairman, so you took about 13 groups of people, maybe 100 people in the room around a big table. And I said, well, they said, no, we're not ready for you to come in. And so there ensued for 2 full days a debate on my fitness for the job. And I was put in an office right across the hall, and they piped in the debate. It was kind of spooky or unusual to hear these people, many of whom didn't even know me, denouncing me, praising me, arguing over my abilities and fairness. And at 1:30, after 2 days, at 1:30 a.m., the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, then Lord Mayo, came in and said, we're going in. It sounded like an invasion of enemy territory. So we walked through a door into this large room, and there was pandemonium. People were shouting. Dr. Paisley and his group, his party, the DUP, were just to my right, and beside them were another small conservative party, and they were all chanting in unison, sort of like cheerleaders at a sporting event, no, 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 no. And there was a chair with a big marker, chairman, and there was a guy sitting in the chair. I didn't know who it was, so I thought maybe I'm not going to be chairman after all. So I walked over. It was a British civil servant, and he said, we're concerned that they might try to have someone sit in the chair and force an arrest to get attention. So he said, I occupied this chair for you. He said, now, as I get up slowly, you sit down slowly. And so he kind of sidled up one side and I sat down. So the chanting continued for several minutes, and then Dr. Paisley delivered a scathing denunciation of me, very loud, and pointing out everything that's wrong with me. And I have to admit he had a certain amount of material to work with. Well, finally, it's when I first saw in person the standard Northern Ireland political tactic of the dramatic walkout. Get up, you denounce your opponent. When you finish with a dramatic flourish, you throw all your papers down on the table, and before the opponent can get up and answer, you walk out the door. So they walked out. Now it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I decided I had to do something, so I sort of made up a talk to the delegates about the importance of keeping going, and I thought now that we've established to get some traction, about 3 a.m., I adjourned the meeting, and I set a resumption of the meeting for 11 a.m. that day. I said, everybody go home, get a few hours sleep, and then we'll come back at 11 o'clock. We're going to start on the business. I went out, and I telephoned Dr. Paisley and the leader of the other party. And I said to them, you made your point. I said, you have every opportunity to denounce me, and you can do it again if you want, but it's in your interest to go back into the talks because we're going ahead anyway, with or without you. And they came the next morning. They came and stayed in. In the case of those two parties, they stayed for about a year and a half, and then when Sinn Féin finally came in, they walked out for good. But that gives you an idea of what it was like. Not like it was when I was a federal judge. I had a robe, and everybody stood up when I came in. Everybody sat down, then they stood up again when I left. Quite a difference.
So before Holy Week and Good Friday, 1998, what do you think was the key, most decisive single component of the entire process that made it possible to get there? As you were liaising with the different parties, going back and forth, 3 steps forward, 10 steps back, what do you think really was the turning point where you thought we can do this?
Well, I think it'll take time and the judgment of history to sort it all out. And sometimes when you're in the middle of a hurricane, you're not the best judge of what is actually going on. I had to deal with so many crises, which in retrospect seem petty, but at the time loomed large. You never knew when someone was going to walk out, or there were many violent acts that occurred, many murders, bombings, assassinations during the talks. Just to keep the thing alive was a very difficult task. But I think the judgment of history will be that the people of Northern Ireland, after many years of this truly bitter and savage conflict, which created widespread fear and anxiety. Keep in mind that while the numbers of people killed were not large by the standards of violent conflict, the numbers of people permanently maimed was very large. Yeah. There was a brutal war going on involving maiming and crippling people short of death. Still a legacy of that, many in Northern Ireland, many of whom I have met with and visited. And so it was tremendously fearful on all sides. And as in all wars, when it began, there were public commitments to limitations. We're only going to target this or that. And as in all wars, as it ground on, the limitations quickly vanished and it became just all-out killing without regard for who or what. So I think the people understood the consequences of failure and insisted. The entry of women into politics for this purpose was a crucial fact. And I found in the nearly 2 years of our talks and in the preceding year and a half and later when the process collapsed, I went back again. The delegates on all sides would say to me, we have to keep it going. Every time a murder or a prominent assassination or a bombing occurred, I would receive calls telling me, we can't have a meeting because it's just too difficult now. You know enough about Northern Ireland to know that they had these hugely attended, highly publicized emotional funerals regularly on weekends, accompanied with demands for revenge. But they would say to me, it's up to you, Senator, to keep it going. And the British and Irish governments would ask me to hold a press conference every time the talks were suspended to say how good things were going. So I would not have a meeting. I would go to them. I would go to their offices one at a time. Some would come one at a time to my office, and we went through the motions of continuity until the dust settled and we could get back in. So it was very difficult, but gradually, if you listen long enough, you begin to understand what they really mean. You are more able to sort out the rhetoric from the reality. You can identify perhaps tiny islands where there's an overlapping of interest and maybe grow them into larger islands. And so we stayed at it. And I think ultimately it was, as I said in my remarks, the courage of the men and women who did it. It was enormously courageous of them. It cost some their lives, cost some their careers, cost most of them tremendous anxiety for their families, but they did change history.
I know there were many points along the way where things felt very low and looked very bleak. Was there one single moment that, looking back, you think this was the worst moment when you felt everything might unravel? And if there was, how did you overcome that? How was it overcome?
There were two such moments that stand out in my mind. When Prime Minister Major called me and asked me to chair the negotiations, I said to him, how long do you think it'll last? He said, you'll be home by Christmas. many years later, I asked him about that. He said, well, I didn't say which year. So it was very difficult personally. When I retired from the Senate, I got married. It was difficult. I left to go to Northern Ireland 3 weeks after I got married. But my wife's an independent person and very supportive, and you always have a struggle to balance work and family obligations. But in October of 1997, after nearly a year and a half, where there was virtually no progress. Every inch forward was 2 yards back, and it was invective and insults, enormous, incredible repetition. I just say that I have made so many mistakes in my life, and I have made so many really stupid statements. None more stupid than the first day of the negotiations when we resumed at 11 o'clock, mindful of their unwillingness to listen to each other. I said to the delegates in a moment of naivete, I said, look, I know you don't listen to each other, but I want you all to know I will listen to whatever you have to say. And I said, I'm a product of the U.S. Senate. As Senate Majority Leader, I listened to a 16-hour speech, many 12 and 8-hour speeches. I can take anything you guys throw. How I regretted that in the years ahead. How many times I sat there and heard the same guy say the same thing day after day after day. But it did help. It did help because it enabled me to first establish some credibility with them. I mentioned earlier the opposition when I started. So when they came back, they asked for a private meeting. And I, of course, granted them the meeting, and they said, well, we came back to the talks, but we're still very unhappy that you're chairman. And the way we're going to express it is we will not call you chairman. I said, well, I said, sorry. I said, what do you want to call me? They said, senator. I said, well, I've been called a lot worse than that. So the opposition called me senator, and the rest of them called me chair. But they came around in the end, and by the time it finished, we were all buddies.
Well, tell us a bit more about that final lap. So the week the agreement was signed, yeah. The frantic back and forth negotiations, the all-night sessions, especially the final night. Yeah. Can you give us some insight into how tense it was, the going back and forth, renegotiating, compromising, going back to accommodate particular objections? And what did it feel like being in the midst of that week?
Right. Well, I didn't complete my prior answer. I got into digression. But so when my son was born, I made it home literally by an unbelievable good fortune, just as my wife was getting ready to go to the hospital. So my son was born, and it had been very difficult. And so I told my wife, I think maybe I should now stay home. I called the president. I told him and his national security advisor. But after a couple of days, my wife encouraged me to go back, and the president urged me to go back. And so I said, okay, I will go back and try to. That was in October. In December, we hit pretty much, in December and January, we hit rock bottom. Just before Christmas, I think it was just a couple of days before Christmas, I had gotten them close enough to an agreement on a statement of the issues. Not the answers to the questions, just what the questions were. Now, mind you, this is a year and a half in. We hadn't got agreement on a statement of the issues. And we had a meeting just for Christmas. I thought we were going to wrap it up. Instead, it dissolved into a shouting, swearing, cursing, yelling match. I rarely have ever felt so angry and discouraged in my life. And we broke up and left for Christmas. In January, we met in London. And in between, on December 27th, a prominent unionist paramilitary, Billy Wright, was murdered in prison by a group of nationalist prisoners. That touched off a retaliatory assassination, and then the tit for tat started. And so the violence was rising rapidly. And that dominated the session in London as we had to expel a couple of parties that were associated with paramilitaries. After the disaster of London, we moved to Dublin, and that was a double disaster. Now the Unionists all wanted Sinn Féin expelled because of the retaliatory killing. So we had an ugly, ugly wrangle for a week in Dublin. And on the flight from Dublin to New York in the middle of February, I concluded that the process as constituted was doomed to failure, and that I calculated that in a matter of weeks it would disintegrate in the rising violence. So I thought there's only one chance, and it's just a chance, that's if we have an early unbreakable deadline to force a decision before the violence got out of hand. And I took out a legal pad and I wrote out a plan for 2-week intense negotiations. I set up a set of cascading subjects with a toll gate or a marker for each day. I figured it would take me about a month to get them to agree to it, which it did. And I, mindful of the history of Ireland and the residents of Easter weekend, I established midnight Thursday, Holy Friday, Thursday as the deadline, knowing that we needed a cushion of about 24 hours. And the first time I felt any real hope was when they all agreed to the deadline. It took a long time. It was sort of like picking up sticks. I think you got, by then there were 8 parties and 2 governments. So I got 1 to agree. Then I'd go to number 2 and they want to change something. I go back to number 1. And I get 1 and 2, then you go to number 3. I went back to number 1 about 15 times. But we finally got them all to agree. And interestingly, we did not achieve the stated goal on any one of the last 14 days. It all came together on the last day. Yeah. And thanks to the courage of the political leaders, they made the decision.
Who surprised you the most out of all the people you had to deal with?
Oh, that's a tough one. There were a lot of surprises. I have to say that there were many great men and women. John Hume is generally considered to be, rightly in my opinion, the architect of the process. He devoted his life to the cause of a united Ireland through peaceful and democratic means. He conceived the way the negotiations should be structured in 3 what we called strands, or what Americans would call 3 sections. The relationship within Northern Ireland between the 2 communities, the relationship between the north and south of Ireland, and the relationship between Ireland and the UK. And that's exactly the way the strands were set up. And that made it possible to reach agreement, because there are a lot of different issues across strands that we were able to use. So John clearly, he was assisted ably by a brilliant, brilliant man named Seamus Mallon, who was John's deputy. First-class negotiator, powerful, skillful orator, and many, many others. The women made a terrific contribution. Monica McWilliams, a nationalist, Pearl Sager, a unionist. On the unionist side, David Trimble had the courage to deliver the Ulster Unionists at the last minute, at great risk. Indeed, his political career in Northern Ireland ended as a result of that. And so I think the Nobel Committee got it right. There wouldn't have been a process without John Hume, and there wouldn't have been an agreement without David Trimble. And there were many, many others. I mean, I don't want to slight anyone, because every one of them demonstrated tremendous courage and vision. And that's one of the reasons I so much enjoy Northern Ireland, because I know what they can do at a critical moment.
So Seamus Malin has famously said the Good Friday Agreement was Sunningdale for slow learners, talking about a much earlier agreement in the early 70s.
Seamus is good with catchy phrases.
Now, whether or not you think that's a fair comment or assessment, and you may have some thoughts to comment on that, but you were recently back in Belfast last week, getting the freedom of the city of Belfast. Congratulations, with President Clinton. And you've been back many times since. In the last 20 years, what strikes you as having changed the most in Northern Ireland?
Oh, the absence of violence, without a doubt. It's a completely different society. I know there are people here from Northern Ireland. I know Norman's here. When I was there, this is after the ceasefires were declared. When I left my hotel to go to the airport, I had to leave 3 hours early because you never knew when a roadblock was going to be thrown up. I mentioned the incident with my wife. I stood in the Europa Hotel and looked out the window and saw this spectacular, almost unbelievable pile of furniture and material that formed a bonfire, so intense that it melted the lamps, the steel lamps in the parking lot in which it was located. I saw so many funerals. Heartbreaking, especially when you'd see a small coffin, a white coffin. That's how they buried the children. It is really, really heartrending. Even after the agreement was ratified, I came home. I was in Maine writing my book when I got word of the bombing at Omagh. Just a truly incredible disaster. There was a practice, custom, I guess you'd call it, of those who set the bombs to telephone in warnings just a few minutes before. Seems like a rather incongruous act, but tended, I guess, to reduce the number of casualties. And in Omagh, a small market town with a square on which City Hall sits and narrow streets leading off it, there was a misunderstanding, and nobody has ever been able to conclusively determine what happened, but the police, receiving the information for those who received the calls, were under the impression that the bomb was in the City Hall square, where it was very packed. It was a beautiful August Saturday afternoon. It's a market town. People from all the small towns are there. And so the people started running in fear down the narrow side streets. And there, 400 yards away from the city square, was parked a small automobile packed with 500 pounds of bombs. And as people ran down that street, steep buildings on each side surrounded the car. It exploded, killing 29 and injuring, brutally, terribly injuring over 350 people. So it's a hard thing to do. And President Clinton called me and asked me if I would go back with him the following Saturday to Omagh to a service for the victims' families and the survivors. And I'll never forget it. It was a hot, steamy night in a public facility, and we spent the evening. They asked each of us to meet with dozens of the families. It was an incredible thing to listen to and to talk with them, but it gave you some idea of their strength and courage. There's a young girl named Claire Gallagher. She was 15, an aspiring pianist. Both of her eyes were blown out by the blast. Her face was covered with raw scars. And all she said to me was, "Keep going, Senator, keep going." It's that things you can't forget, and it's a demonstration of their courage.
In the light of that, for most of the last 20 years, Northern Ireland has lived without protracted violence, and the sheer venom of the sectarianism that was rampant before the peace process. Before we open up to the audience, just two more final questions to consider. The first is about where you think Northern Ireland is heading, particularly in the light of the collapse of the shared executive. That executive, of course, was the direct outcome of the Good Friday Agreement, and also the turmoil and uncertainty being caused by Brexit, which we've spoken about earlier, some discussions today. Are there any practical steps you'd recommend be implemented in Northern Ireland today to safeguard and enhance the fruits of the peace process?
Well, yes. First and foremost, the two parties should get together and resolve the pending issue. Mm-hmm. I think it was F.D. de Klerk, the former president of South Africa, who, when asked about the difficulty of negotiating with Mandela, said the hard part is not when you sit and negotiate across the table with the adversary to reach an agreement that by definition involves some compromise. The hard part is when you take that agreement and go back to your community and say, we have an agreement, it's a good agreement, but it's less than 100% of what we want. Mm-hmm. And you have to stand up to the people in your community, in your party. And that's what they did in 1998. And that's what they must do now. And one of the participants in the talks, one of the leaders in the talks, said to me just 3 to 4 days ago there, this issue is nothing compared to what they had to do in 1998. And remember, my answer was about the difference in the absence of violence. It's also different in terms of prosperity, in terms of, but now it's a long way from ideal. There's not genuine reconciliation. There's not integration of the communities. There's not the absence of, there's not an absence of mistrust. That's still there. But it is immeasurably better. And nobody, except for the very tiniest fringes on both sides, nobody wants to go back to the way it was. People recognize that it's much better now, and it's incumbent on the political leaders to lead. And lead doesn't mean getting your way. I know it's hard in public life. When I was in Northern Ireland, all the time I was there, I never met a person who said they were against peace. Everybody, I'm for peace, I'm for peace. Well, you say, what does peace mean to you? And to most people, it means the other side accepting what we want, because our side is right and they're wrong. And so, and they've been conditioned to that over decades. And it takes very strong, courageous, and articulate leaders to make the case to their own community. And that's what's lacking now.
So we know there's work to be done. A process, by definition, is an open-ended undertaking. But there are triumphs and transformations, as you pointed towards, to be celebrated and commemorated. Above all, the Good Friday Agreement, the peace process itself in its entirety, was a triumph for compromise, accommodation, and inclusivity. Are there any other places and political entities that you think could learn from adopting those virtues today?
I've been asked that a lot, particularly with reference to the Middle East, where I did 2 tours of duty. While there are similarities in conflict, and I was somewhat involved in the Balkans, while there are many similarities, differences in religion and national identity, territorial disputes, I believe that each conflict, really like each human, is unique. And the solution must be unique. It must be grounded in the history and culture of the people in the conflict, and it must be their agreement. I mentioned earlier the stupid statement I made on the first day. I also made some statements that weren't stupid. And one of them was, I said to the delegates, I do not bring with me an American peace plan. There's no Clinton plan, there's no Mitchell plan. I said, if there ever is an agreement, it will be your agreement, because this is your home, and it is you who will live with the consequences. And when we drafted the agreement, my colleagues and I, who should not go unmentioned, Harry Holkeri, the former Prime Minister of Finland, John Duchasseling, the former Chief of the Canadian General Staff, both just truly outstanding men with whom I worked, with whom we never had a single disagreement. And when we drafted that document, that I read from tonight, we made sure that every single word in that agreement was spoken or written by someone from Northern Ireland. And on the early morning of April 10th, 1998, when I distributed to the 8 parties remaining the final document, I included a cover note from me in which I reminded them of my statement, and I said to them, every word in this agreement was spoken or written by you. This is your agreement. You own it, and you will deserve the credit when it's agreed. And that's what happened. Thank you.
Well, Senator, you've kindly agreed to take a couple of questions from the floor. So as we do that, can I just ask people to be very succinct so we can fit in a couple of questions or more and hear the Senator's answer. And we've had a great address tonight and several great addresses today. We don't need any more speeches.
Don't be too rough on, don't be too rough on the
So
audience.
there's one here in the middle. The light's very bright up here, but I see one in the middle, and just keep waving if...
My name is Kevin Sullivan. I had the good fortune to stand next to you, Senator.
Yeah, bring the mic up.
My name is Kevin Sullivan. I was a Clinton staffer during the Clinton administration. I had the good fortune to stand next to you in Arma as in 1998 as President gave a speech. And my question to you is this. Over the last 4 to 5 years, there have been a series of intense negotiations, the Stormont House Agreement, the Fresh Start Agreement. Richard Haas came in for 6 months. And then the last year, we've had a series of agreements where they sign on the dotted line. Both the UK government and the Irish government support these agreements.
Yeah, I guess you got to get the mic closer. I can't hear you too well.
Okay, you want me to start over real quickly? Okay, in the last 4 to 5 years, there have been a whole series of intense negotiations.
Yeah.
The Stormont House Agreement, the Fresh Start Agreement, Richard Haas being there for 6 months, and the last year of negotiations. And they get the backing of the UK government, the backing of the Irish government, they sign on the dotted line, and then things fall apart and they break down. Yeah. So what is the current problem where they go through these negotiations, go through these intense processes, and yet they can't get it across the line after they make the agreement? And your recommendations.
Yeah, I think I understand it. I can't hear it all too well, but what you have to understand is that the Good Friday Agreement was a political compromise. The best that could be done at the time, imperfect, didn't resolve all the issues, and it didn't resolve any issues for all time. And you described several other discussions that have occurred since then. And so I think you have to accept that in all human societies, there is no final end stage of end of problems. They keep coming up. You get new leaders, you get new people in different positions, and circumstances change, political dynamics change, and it's going to be constant. I think they're going to solve this issue, but who knows, next year, the year after. In July of 1999, a year after the agreement was approved and ratified, it fell apart again. And the Prime Ministers and the President called me and asked me back. I went back for 6 months, and we kind of, in a Rube Goldberg exercise, get it back on the track. So I think the answer, if I understood your question, is that it's going to be constant, going to be continual problems. There'll be new disagreements, new alignments of parties. Don't forget, there's tremendous political competition in Northern Ireland within each community. It isn't just the two communities against each other. There's a tremendous ongoing dynamic competition within, and that's going to continue. So I think it'll be a constant state of new issues and new leaders, and we have to be generally supportive.
Other questions? So down here in the middle on the left.
Yeah.
My name is Sarah Smith. I'm with the American Action Forum. I have a practical question about what kind of staff resources you were
About what?
provided. About what
The
sort of
staff resources?
you were provided.
Translate the question for me.
And while you were in Northern Ireland during the negotiations, and to what extent staff enabled you to get to the end game or not? Were all of the negotiations between the principals? And just if you could elaborate a little bit on that, that'd be helpful.
So what sort of staff resources you had when you were in Northern Ireland, and what role did they play? How critical were they?
Yeah. I had a very small but brilliant staff. I had 3 people who worked for me, 3 Americans. A woman named Martha Pope, who had been my administrative assistant when I was in the Senate. When I became majority leader, I appointed her the first woman ever to be the Sergeant at Arms of the Senate. And she went with me. I had another young man, a lawyer, young man from Maine, who named Kelly Curry. He's gone on to a brilliant career. He served in the United States Attorney's Office in Eastern District of New York. Now he's in private practice. And then the State Department assigned to me a man named David Pazorski, who had been the American consul in Belfast. And he knew all of the participants, knew the issues quite well. That was my entire staff, although I got a lot of help from the British and Irish public servants. I mentioned that in my remarks. I have to say the quality of their Foreign Service officials in both countries was superb. Brilliant at devising ways around complicated and difficult problems. They were extraordinarily helpful to me. And staff were useful at all levels. Prime Minister Holkery had a small staff, but able, as did General de Chastelain, and we employed them very, very effectively. They made they established important relationships among all the parties, tried to keep us sort of be like an intelligence service, keep us informed of what was really going on as opposed to what appeared to be going on. And so I have to say, in all sincerity, it would not have been possible without their tremendous assistance.
One there.
Is this on? Yeah. Senator Mitchell, sorry, I'll try and
No, go ahead.
go around the thing. As I understand it, the position of Special Envoy to Northern Ireland from the U.S. is now vacant. And my question is, with respect to sort of the ongoing implementation of the Good Friday Accords, how important in your judgment is it that that position be filled?
Yeah. I think more important than the Special Envoy position is what the message is from the President and the Secretary of State. To the extent that I was helpful in Northern Ireland, it was in part because President Clinton asked me to go there, and he went there. He talked about it a lot. He presented himself in Northern Ireland and spoke to the people there to convey directly the genuine concern that he had. I have no doubt in my mind that whatever effect I had would have been far less had he just sent me over and that was it. It could be helpful, but we've had a succession of envoys, and in many cases there was very little effect because there wasn't the message from the highest level. So I think it takes, it may be helpful, but by itself it doesn't, it won't be of the maximum assistance possible. And I don't think it takes a lot for a president. I mean, Clinton had an unusual interest in it, and he became intimately familiar with every detail. I'll just tell one anecdote about it. In September of 1996, after the negotiations had begun, the president called me and said that he was about to have 2 debates with Senator Dole, who was the Republican nominee that year, was a presidential election year. And he asked me if I would come back and play the role of Bob Dole in the mock debates. because I knew Dole and I are very close friends to this day, and we debated every day for 6 years, so I knew him pretty well. And at first I declined. I said, look, you asked me to come here and let me stay here and do the work. Oh, he said, you can come for a couple of weeks. So I did. And the first debate was held in Hartford, but the preparation was in Chautauqua, New York, an upstate resort town. And I arrived there middle of the week. His staff had sent me this much material to read, and I'd read every bit of it religiously. So I went into the, and I got a call, asked on arrival, would I have dinner with the president? So I went and had dinner with him. And I've got all this material about the debate. And the first question he asked was about Northern Ireland. And for 1.5 hours, that's all we talked about. We never got to the material in the books. It was a couple of days, so he got to it later. He did a good job in the debate. But I thought to myself, this guy really is interested. He's not just saying it because it was a private dinner. And literally, we spent 1.5 hours talking about the issues in Northern Ireland, the people. The result is he knows them all. He knows all the issues. And that has an impact. It has an impact on the individuals. That you know, the President of the United States knows who they are. He knows their kids. He knows their dog's name. And he knows all about their backgrounds. It does have an impact. So he does deserve a lot of credit. And I think that's the important thing. And I don't think it's very difficult or time-consuming either. I think it can be done in a way that just conveys the message.
Well, Senator Mitchell, I wish we could continue this enthralling conversation all evening. We could just put this fire on, get a couple of whiskeys, and just continue. However, we know that all good things come to an end. Before I formally thank you, I just want to also thank several other people, particularly the staff of the Berkley Center, especially Carly, Amy, and Nick, all of our student helpers today, and the wonderful technicians and catering staff. Also to thank you, all of you, for coming, our audience throughout the day. It's been a fascinating day. And also to thank all of our speakers and moderators and those who helped make it possible, especially Coylene Parsons, Irene Gilson, the Northern Ireland Bureau, Norman Houston for their support, Brian Cahalan and Michael Lonergan, and the Embassy of Ireland, who really helped make this the wonderful day it's been. Senator Mitchell, you helped transform the island of Ireland, and especially the lives of people in Northern Ireland. I think everyone connected with Ireland will be forever in your debt. Today, we are especially in your debt for sharing this story with us, and we're honoured and privileged you came to be with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.